welcome everyone to this IR seminar from the ANU Bell School. My name is Nicholas Lemay-Hebert. I'm the Director of Research. Start with an acknowledgement of the country, So we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we virtually meet, and we pay our respects to the elder, past and present. We are really lucky to have a very distinguished guest today. We have Chris Reus-Smit from the University of Queensland. His presentation is based on a paper that we have circulated a few weeks ago. So the paper's title is Global Historical Sociology and the Liberal State. As usual, we will have a presentation by Chris, and then we'll have a Q&A. I will encourage people to use the raise hand function, especially that we are a good group of people. It's hard for me to be able to track everyone who is basically trying to kind of virtually shout at me to have something to say, and especially the order of appearance. So if you can use the raise hand function that you will find in the participant section. So if you click on participants at the bottom of your screen, you will see a blue hand, and if you can raise it when you want to ask a question at the Q&A, and obviously also click on it again if your question has been answered. Also, Kian reminded me that if you feel a little bit alone in this virtual event, there's always the possibility of clicking on speaker view or also on gallery view, and the gallery view makes it a little bit more collective or collegial, so we see a little bit more everyone's face and reaction to the conversation. So Chris Reus-Smit, just to introduce our speaker, doesn't really need an introduction, I guess, is a professor of international relations at the University of Queensland. He was chair at the European University Institute in Florence, and he was also the head of the ANU Department of International Relations here between 2001 and 2010. He's the editor of the very well-known Cambridge Studies in International Relations book series, and he has published a number of books. His two latest is on cultural diversity with Cambridge University Press, and in 2013 also individual rights and the making of the international system, also with Cambridge University Press. Chris, again, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's great to meet you virtually and to get to know you, and thanks again. And the floor is yours. Presenting a little bit on your paper, and hopefully we'll have a very vibrant Q&A right after that.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. That's for the very kind introduction, and it's terrific being back talking to an ANU audience. Some of you will know that there's a bit of a joke going around that it's almost exactly 4 years since I last spoke at the ANU. In fact, it was exactly on the day of the US election count. In fact, literally during my seminar was the moment in which the election swung to Trump. I can tell you, I guarantee this, anyone who's here who was at that seminar probably remembers nothing about it. A, because they weren't concentrating on anything I said, and B, because the deep trauma of that moment has sort of wiped out everything that they can remember of the day other than that one thing. But one of the things that, what I was doing in that presentation 4 years ago was presenting to you the argument that really, at the very beginning of a big project that I've been working on for about 8 years on cultural diversity and international order. And at that time, I was speaking to the very beginnings of the theoretical argument from that project, which was about to come out in an article in IO, and subsequently was developed in theoretically in my 2018 book on cultural diversity, and then was developed empirically in the book that's just come out, edited with Andrew Phillips, on culture and order in world politics. And they're the first two volumes of a trilogy that I'm doing on this subject of cultural diversity and international order. And what I want to do today is to speak to you about one of the core sort of theoretical elements of the what will be the third book in the trilogy, which will be called Governing Difference and Historical Sociology of the Liberal International Order. So what that book's doing is really bringing the whole argument that I've developed about cultural diversity in the international order up to try and understand the development of the liberal international order over the past 2 centuries, and to try and provide a framework for thinking about in a sense, the situation we're in at the moment in thinking about questions of culture and international order. So what I want to do is to talk to you about sort of one key argument that will be part of that book. Now, the paper that you've had, I've actually reworked to kind of better situate it in debates about liberal states and international order. And I'm going to actually speak to the revised version. So a lot of the substance and meat of it is exactly the same, but I'll be cutting into it in a slightly different way. What I want to do is to develop an argument today about the nature of liberal states, and a lot of the discussion is focused on that and how we should think about liberal states. Second, I want to make an argument about the imperative, the special imperative that liberal states have to engage in particular kinds of social bordering, which I'll define when we get to that part of the discussion. And then finally, to talk about the implications of that for thinking in particular about the development of hierarchies in the liberal international order over the past 2 centuries. So the structure is I'm going to begin by talking about the liberal state in conventional accounts of the liberal international order. I'm then going to talk about global historical sociology, and I can see George Lawson sitting there, one of the principal advocates of this perspective. And I do see my project as sitting within that framework, but I also want to highlight a particular gap in that literature at the moment. That gap has to do with the theorization of the liberal state, which I'm then going to go and talk more about. I'm going to reconceive the liberal state, focusing on what I term the primacy of politically equal rights-bearing individuals, and then explain how that relates to particular kinds of social bordering. And finally, to finish up by talking about the implications for thinking about the liberal international order. So let me begin just very quickly to go over how the liberal state is understood in conventional accounts of the liberal international order. And here, I'm thinking of everybody from sort of Eichenberry through to Mearsheimer through to, Janice Bialy-Matten and all the people who've been writing on the liberal international order within the kind of mainstream. Now, in that literature, liberal states are given a special significance. They're seen as having a particularly important role in constructing and sustaining a liberal international order. And there's 3 arguments that are generally made about how liberal states affect the nature of the liberal international order. The first one is an argument about their preferences. So this is an argument, this is a kind of rationalist sort of argument that says liberal states have these preferences. They can be issue-specific preferences for things like cooperative security, free trade, human rights, but they can also be institutional preferences for, in particular, for multilateralism, for particular forms of contractual international law. So the argument is that because liberal states have been materially ascendant, they've used their kind of advantaged position to shape a liberal international order that reflects those preferences. The second sort of argument is one that emphasizes the institutional form of liberal states. And this is actually a space that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about in the talk because I think it's very important and it's where I want to do my work. But at the moment, the argument essentially focuses on their democratic representative nature. And of course, one version of that argument is the various positions that talk about the connection between democracy and war proneness. So, and there's now quite a wide spectrum of those. There's the sort of argument that the traditional democratic peace argument, which is that because democracies are representative of their population's opinion, in addition to the particular identity that they have, that leads them to be more war averse, or at least averse to war with particular kinds of protagonists. But of course, there are other versions of that. There's Lisa Martin's argument about how democratic institutions actually lead democratic states to be more warlike in particular kinds of contexts. So there's that argument. There's a second argument about how legislative institutions, and this is a kind of out of the rational choice framework, how legislative institutions actually help states to make credible commitments in international cooperation and international negotiations. Again, it's an argument about the particular institutional form of liberal states. The third argument is an argument that is, which is an argument that I've made, if you go back to my early work in the moral purpose of the state, which is that liberal states have actually engaged in a process of transplanting their kind of domestic institutional priorities and preferences into the international arena. This argument is less an argument specifically about preferences than an argument about institutional imagination. That this is how liberal states imagine legitimate forms of international institutional cooperation, and they transplant that into the international arena. And the argument that I'd made back then was that you can explain the shift and the rise of institutional practices like positive international law and multilateralism as a consequence of the 19th century rise of liberal states and how they came to shape the nature of international institutions. Now, the third argument about the connection between liberal states and the international order is best expressed by John Eikenberry in his new book, A World Safe for Democracy, in which he basically hones in on the existential needs of liberal states. That liberal states haven't tried to shape the international order with their ideals of free trade and human rights and cooperative security and so forth, and multilateralism and international law because out of some kind of utopian zeal, but rather because they've believed that it's only by crafting an international order based on such things that democracy can survive, right? So this is actually an argument, and I think for those of you who follow John's work, this is an interesting argument to follow because John's really making an argument about the kind of anxieties of modernity and being a liberal state in the context of a modernity that can bring great prospects for humanity, but also catastrophic, almost terminal disasters, right? And of course, total war being the classic example of that. So I think all of these arguments shed some light on the impact of liberal states on the nature of the liberal international order. But I think that they suffer from two principal problems. And the first one is that their understanding of the institutional form of liberal states is incomplete. When they talk about the institutional form of a liberal state, they emphasize its democratic and representative institutions. But they ignore the fact, and this is well held in political theory, but hasn't percolated into IR discussions, that the thing that's distinctive about liberal states is not just that they're democratic states, but they are limited states. And that's the language that gets used. Liberal states are limited states. And they're limited in a distinctive way. Of course, there have been limited states throughout history. Even absolutist states were limited by ideas about the moral primacy of God's law and natural law. But liberal states are limited states because of the primacy that they attach to politically equal rights-bearing individuals. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But this seems to me to be something that is distinctive about liberal states that has actually been neglected in arguments about the connection between the institutional form of the liberal state and its impact on ordering at the international level. The second problem with this literature and its treatment of the liberal state is it treats the liberal state as static, right? so there are liberal states. They have democratic representative institutions. That's a liberal state. That's what liberal states looked like in 1945. That's what they look like today. That's what they look like in 1970. And we can just theorize about them as though that form is constant. Whereas, as that actually liberal states began their lives as empire states. And they transformed over the course of, I would say, 150 years into national states. And that was a fundamental transformation in the institutional form of the liberal state. And yet that's national order. Now, most people who write on the liberal international order now, of course, feel obliged to say, well, of course, there were many liberals that were, big supporters of empire. Oh, by the way, yes, these liberal states once had empires, but it's in fact, it's very rare for somebody to be theorizing of the changing nature of the liberal state. And I think that's actually something we need to be doing if we want to understand the effect of the liberal state on the liberal international order. Now, by the way, before I go on, just so that you're clear, I believe that the liberal international order has about a 2-century history. I don't believe the liberal international order is a post-1945 construction. I'm not going to argue that case now, but we can have that argument if you want. But I'm just going to put it out there so you know the kind of universe, the historical universe in which I'm working. Okay. But I think, by the way, that doesn't really do much to undermine my argument about empire states and liberal states, because most of the leading liberal power states, at least for 2 decades after 1945. So it really doesn't matter when we cut in. That transition is a crucial transition. So let me turn to historical sociology, in particular to global historical sociology. And as I said, I'm mindful that George is sitting there. So I think that global historical sociology, which is the kind of most recent manifestation of attempts to apply historical sociology to international relations and to the study of global politics, I think it offers 3 significant advantages, right, that together provide a framework for thinking in more fruitful ways about the liberal state and its relationship to liberal international order. And those 3 advantages stem from 3 of its kind of cardinal intellectual commitments. Now, the first of those commitments, and this derives from the kind of relational sociology that underlies, excuse me while I turn my phone off. Okay, so it relates to the relational sociology that underlies global historical sociology. And this is the idea that all social forms, of which the sovereign state is perhaps the most important, but we can include empires, we include international orders, we can include nations, are always to be understood as entities in motion. And so the thing about global historical sociology is that it refuses the idea that these are, in some sense, essential forms that are kind of timeless in any way. Right? So that's the first commitment from global historical sociology. And that's useful because that provides a language in which we can talk about the transformation of the liberal state from an empire state to a national state. The second thing in global historical sociology is a commitment to multiscalarity. So, and this is a commitment that says we need to be looking at social forces and processes that are operating at the national, the international, the transnational, the global, the imperial. Not only do we need to bring those into a kind of singular analytical framework, but we also have to understand how these are constituted through interaction with each other over time. Right? And I think that's important because one of the things we struggle with in trying to think about the liberal international order over its long history is to think about how that order has, in fact, the kind of underlying organizing principle of it, which moves from being essentially an imperial order to an order of sovereign states, how that is fluid and dynamic. And if we're holding, if we're trying to think about this in the lens of, we're international relations scholars, so we study, the external relations between sovereign states, then we're never going to be able to capture that transformation. And so multiscalarity, I think, helps us analytically in that respect. The third thing is that global historical sociology, as the name suggests, emphasizes the global, right? It emphasizes global interconnectedness, the importance of global processes in shaping and transforming institutional forms. And I think that's incredibly important, because part of the story of the transformation of liberal states is actually a story about very localized political struggles within the metropole of liberal empire states, but it's also a story about the role of other actors located in the periphery of empire states who transform, and those interlinked struggles are transforming the nature of these liberal states and the order in which they're embedded over time. And so the global perspective, and actually this is a perspective that Tim Dunn and I adopted in our book on the globalization of international society. So I see that as being a contribution to the global historical sociology literature. Now, I think the biggest issue with global historical sociology is that it actually suffers from a problem that bedevils all historical sociology. And that is that it is never, I believe, and a lot of the paper is devoted to arguing this case, partly because when I was writing it, I had kind of George on my shoulder that who I wanted to persuade. But part of the argument is that historical sociology, this is the body of literature that spent more time and energy on trying to understand the state historically, actually I think has never really fully captured the nature of the liberal state. And let me just walk you through what I think are the various approximations that historical sociologists have made toward something called the liberal state, but that they've never really got there. So, in historical sociology, in a sense, a cardinal sort of commitment of historical sociology has been an emphasis on the modern state, which is understood as a rational bureaucratic state. And a huge amount of ink has been spent by historical sociologists over a long, long history trying to understand that modern state. But as historical sociologists admit themselves, actually the modern state can take any number of forms. It can be a communist state, it can be a fascist state, it can be a democratic state. So the fact that it's a modern state doesn't actually fully get us toward what is distinctive about a liberal state as a particular kind of modern state, because there are clearly modern states that aren't liberal. So a second approximation is when historical sociologists talk about the national state or nation state. And again, a lot of ink has been spent on that. But like the modern state, there are many states that kinds of states that qualify as national or nation states that don't count as liberal states, right? Again, fascist states can be national or nation states. Communist states can be as well. Clearly, liberal states are national states, or in their latter lives are national states of particular kinds, but that doesn't tell us what kind of state they are. Another approximation is democratic states, which would be the one where you think that you're getting close to home on what is essential about a liberal state. Except that we all know, those of us who've sort of looked at the political theory of this, that there's a long-standing anxiety that liberals have about democracy. And this, we can see this in Mill's writings on, the tyranny of the majority. And the thing about a liberal state is that it can't ever be purely democratic, because a purely democratic state in which the majority is unconstrained, in which the majority can take the form of a tyranny, is the problem for liberals, right? And so the thing about liberal states is liberal states place institutional constraints to try and prevent the tyranny of the majority. So while liberal states are generally democratic in some form, just talking about democratic states doesn't get us to the heart of what a liberal state is per se. Now, the final approximation is when, and this comes mainly from Marxist theorists, historical sociologists here. I'm thinking about people like Justin Rosenberg and Benno Teschke. And here the argument is that the thing about liberal states is, when they use the term liberal state, is that it's what I call an exclusively political state. That it's a state that's emerged out of separating of the economic realm from the political realm, right? And this is how, in this argument, you can actually have a world organized politically into sovereign states while having a kind of interdependent global capitalist system. Now, again, I think this is insightful, but it doesn't get us any closer to the liberal state than any of the other arguments, because the argument, when you look at it, really applies to any modern capitalist state, right? So it's a general argument in which the language of liberal has been attached to it, but in fact can include all manner of different kinds of states that are, by their definition, exclusively political. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here, is to carve out a space to re-theorize the liberal state in historical sociology, and particularly in global historical sociology. And as I've suggested, the key move that I want to make is to argue that to understand the liberal state and its changing form, and to understand the relationship between that changing form and the international order, then we need to really take seriously that the thing that is distinctive about liberal states is that they are limited states. And to understand what it is about that, how liberals understand the limits on state authority and how that has been institutionalized over time in the development of the liberal state. Now, there is clearly an immense literature about the diversity of liberal thought, and there are different strands and they're not always compatible with each other. But one of the things that I think does run across the different strands of liberal thinking is this idea that the liberal state is a limited state. And John Gray put it this way. He said, and I agree with him, that all strands within the liberal tradition confer upon persons rights or claims in justice which government must acknowledge and respect, and which indeed may be invoked against government. So one of the things that I do in the paper is to show that that very idea not only runs through sort of canonical liberal texts, but also is embedded in the constitutions of notable liberal states. And of course, this is a tautology in some sense. If I find it in their constitution, then of course I define them as a liberal state. But you can see this in the sort of great declarations of independence of the revolutionary states of France and the United States. You can see it in the 1812 Spanish Constitution, which was then held as being the most liberal constitution in Europe at the time. You can see it in the Indian Constitution as well, and I use those examples. And all of them have in common this idea that there are certain rights that individuals who are recognized as, the recognition part is very important, and I'll get to that because this relates to hierarchies, that who are recognized politically constitute a sort of break, or meant to constitute a break on the exercise of legitimate state power. Okay, so now I want to move on to the kind of key move, which is once we understand the liberal state in that way, then we can start to see how there are certain institutional practices that flow from the very nature of the liberal state. And these practices in particular have to do with what I call social bordering. Now, there have been attempts to draw links between the individualist foundations of modern states, right? That is the idea that somehow the legitimacy of modern states rest on the rights of individuals. But those arguments have tended to focus on how that idea of legitimacy came to influence the emergence of a kind of equalitarian international society, where states were treated as kind of individuals writ large, and where you get the emergence of ideas of law based on consent. You get an emergence of ideas of multilateralism based on the kind of international legislation of international rules. This is essentially the argument that I made in Moral Purpose. But the problem with that argument is that it doesn't actually differentiate liberal states from modern states. And it's an argument that probably best applies to liberal states, not modern states in general. But more importantly, it misses the fact that the very same privileging of the rights of individuals that undergirds the legitimacy of liberal states also leads to forms of social bordering that are hierarchical and exclusionary, which is a kind of, in a sense, this is where my current project parts company with my work in Moral Purpose. They're not incompatible with each other, but this is a part of the story that I was not aware of at the time and certainly didn't tell, okay? So the projects relate to each other in different ways there. Okay, so these are the steps of the argument that I make about the liberal state and social bordering. So I begin with Michael Walzer's argument about the importance of the distribution of membership within any community. And Walzer argues that the primary good that we distribute to one another is membership in some human community. Now, my argument, jumping from that, is that all distributions of membership involve the construction of social boundaries, right, between and around different membership groups. Now, a social boundary, and I use Tilley's work here to simply define a social boundary in the following way, is any contiguous zone of contrasting density, rapid transition, or separation between internally connected clusters of population, and or activity for which human participants create shared meanings. And that's really important, that last bit, that it's not just patterns of density or transition or separation, but it's that humans attach meanings around these that reproduce these social boundaries over time. Okay, so the third step in the argument is an argument, and also I'd like to be keen to hear what you think about this, which is an argument that says, look, there are two ideal types of membership distribution. The first type is what I call segmented and hierarchical. And this is where social boundaries formally divide the political community into differently empowered membership groups. Inequality in this kind of membership distribution is endogenous to political community. So the political community itself is formally stratified. Okay. Now, good examples of that are feudal Europe, you know, how the Ottomans organized authority with the millets, where you actually have the political community divided up into groups which are hierarchically organized in different kinds of political powers and legal powers. The second kind of membership distribution is what I call unified and egalitarian. Now, this is where social boundaries don't divide a political community, they fence it off. And they fence the community of equally empowered individuals from other humans who are deemed unworthy. In this kind of membership distribution, inequality is exogenous to the political community, right? So the whole purpose of the social boundaries is to circle a community of equal rights-bearing individuals. Now, you can already tell from my language that my argument is that in links that occurs and the kind of social boundary drawing. So the key kind of social boundary drawing in a liberal state is the boundary that surrounds the political community of equal rights-bearing individuals. Now, the crucial thing here is that in the history of liberal states, that has never been all human beings, all biological humans. So at the origins of the liberal state, this was landed white men of a particular Christian confession that was fenced off as a rights-bearing political community. And over time, and this is a crucial axis of change, perhaps even the crucial axis of change in the history of liberal states, has been changes in the nature of and inscription of that boundary. And we can think about struggles over the rights of unpropertied men, over the rights of women, over the rights of, the US civil rights struggles over the rights of African Americans. We can see it around the struggles over the rights of Indigenous peoples. All of these are struggles around that social boundary, right? They're over where is the boundary going to be defined as to who is inside that political community of equal rights-bearing individuals. And I would argue that that's actually been a critical axis of change. And I think even when we look, in a sense, we're living through a moment of this at the moment when we look at the US election, because I think a lot of the things that are going on in the US are actually really about that boundary, okay? Okay, so what I want to do now is to move on to the last part of the discussion, which is to say a few words about the liberal state and international order. Now, this is the part of the talk when I was writing it that I just wasn't sure that I had it expressed as simply as it needs to be for a talk, and so I'm gonna just take it as slowly as I can and get the building blocks down and hope that it makes sense. Okay. So I want to return to a central proposition that I have about the history of the liberal international order, and that is that a crucial factor in the evolution of that liberal order has been the transformation of liberal states from empire states into national states. Now, there is a literature, and George's co-author Julian Go makes this argument that in fact there are some states like the United States that have never stopped being empire states. I don't actually agree with that argument. I actually think analytically it's more fruitful to think about there having been a transition from empire states to national states, imperfect as they are. But I'm not going to make that argument now, just to point that out. Okay, so I define empire states, or argue, and this is actually following Julian, that empire states are distinguished by their hierarchical differentiation within the metropole, between metropoles and peripheries, and all this is complicated by metropolitan outsourcing, heterogeneous contracting, and porous frontiers. I distinguish empire states from national states, and I don't distinguish them on the grounds that they're free of hierarchical differentiation. Quite to the contrary. But I do think that there are other things that distinguish national states from empire states. And the two things that are most important are, first of all, they are sovereign and territorial, right? Both in institutional form, but also, and this is the second thing, is they exist within an international system of other political units that are sovereign and territorial that reinforce that institutional form of individual states. And that's very different from the world in which empire states were living at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so that's empire states and national states. Now, my argument is that empire states and national states can both be liberal in the sense that I've been talking about it. Okay, it's not that It's not that, you know, national states are somehow liberal and empire states are not. Empire states and national states can be liberal states in the sense that I understand them. And indeed, the most prominent 19th century and 20th century empire states have been liberal states. Britain, France, the United States. Moreover, they all changed to national states over the course of the 20th century. Now, to grasp this, we need to unpack the idea of hierarchical differentiation a little bit further. And again, Julian's work is very helpful on this. So Julian distinguishes between two kinds of hierarchical differentiation. The first is the hierarchical differentiation of territories, right? So think about empire states. Think about the British Empire. The British Empire distinguished between the United Kingdom, crown colonies, dominions, protectorates, mandates, charter and proprietary colonies, company governed territories, right? This is so that the empire state actually engages in hierarchical differentiation on the basis of territories, distinguishing different kinds of territories that have different kinds of powers and entitlements in the imperial structure. But Julian, and this is the one that interests me most, is Julian also talks about the hierarchical differentiation of humans, that empire states engage in a process of stratifying human beings. And what my argument is that liberal empire states do this on the basis that I've made the argument, and that is they do it on the basis of social bordering that circles the politically equal, the community of politically equal rights-bearing individuals, which is fluid and dynamic over time. Now, there's a burgeoning literature at the moment on how this stratified and political life within liberal empire states has actually evolved over time. Here I'm thinking of Isabel Wilkinson's wonderful book on caste, Maya Goodfellow's book on the hostile environment on immigration in the UK. All of these are looking at how this form of social bordering has worked out within, as a form of hierarchical differentiation of humans within empire states. But this has also shaped how liberal states crafted political authority, the organisation of political authority in the evolving liberal international order. And the example that I use in the paper is James Lorimer's Institutes of the Law of Nations, which is really interesting. And I can see Luke sitting there, so I'd be interested. He might have some thoughts on this. But Lorimer is fascinating in ways that most IR scholars ignore. So Lorimer is famous for having been one of the international lawyers who helped inscribe the distinction, the hierarchical distinctions, the standard of civilization between civilized barbarian and savage peoples. But what's really interesting when you read Lorimer's work is that Lorimer arrives at that distinction through exactly the liberal reasoning that I've described to you. So Lorimer not only divides the world into civilized barbarian and savage peoples, but he argues this on specifically liberal grounds. He talks about how recognized sovereign states are like individuals who have suffrage. But he then goes on to argue that sovereign states can be denied recognition for the very same reasons that you can deny individuals suffrage. He talks about that states can be denied political suffrage for reasons of political nonage, which is that they're too childlike. Now, of course, this was the argument that was used to exclude women and peoples of colour from the community of rights-bearing citizens. It's exactly the same liberal argument. He also talks about how states can be denied on the basis of congenital imbecility, right? Which is just sheer stupidity, which, as many people understand, is actually one of the reasons that Mill used for excluding people from the vote, right? Was that people simply weren't smart enough, didn't have the education enough to be able to exercise the capacities needed for enfranchisement. So what I think here, what we see here, and here, my argument would be with my English school colleagues, which is what we see here is not a purely international account of a European society of states and its exclusion, but it's rather a liberal thesis about justified social bordering in which the analysis and reasoning that's applied domestically is applied to the international order as well. Now, I'm going to just getting close to finishing up, so thank you for bearing with me. A central argument of my cultural diversity trilogy is that international orders develop not in homogeneous cultural contexts, but in heterogeneous cultural contexts. And that order builders seek to order this complexity by constructing what I call diversity regimes. These are sets of institutionalized norms and practices that, one, define legitimate units of political authority, two, authorize certain axes of cultural identification and expression, and three, relate those two things, authority to authorized expressions of difference. Now, over the past century and a half, and this is in a sense what the last book of the trilogy is about, the liberal international order has been organized by a series of diversity regimes. But overall, it has shifted from one based on hierarchical forms of territorial and human differentiation to one based on formal sovereignty qualified by human rights protecting cultural freedoms. Now, I'm not making any claim that we've arrived at this wonderful position of cultural tolerance, but what I'm saying is there are differences in the fundamental regimes for organising cultural difference globally. Now, what I would argue is that this transformation has been driven by struggles over the nature and inscription of liberal social borders, struggles by workers, women, colonised and enslaved peoples. Now that brings me to the end of it. I'm not going to bother summarising it all, but thank you very much and I look forward to your questions.